This is James Sumner, Chief Executive of Mid Cheshire Hospitals Foundation Trust, and you're listening to the HSJ Health Check Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the HSJ Health Check Podcast. I'm Ben Clover, one of the Bureau Chiefs, and each week we gather a team from our expert journalists to explain and debate the most important news of the day affecting NHS policy and leadership. So this week I'm joined by three colleagues. We have correspondents Sharon Brennan and James Illman, plus making his podcast debut with us this week, our editor Alastair McLellan. Now, in each episode we normally tackle 2 or 3 big questions, but this week, obviously, there is one subject that looms large over the landscape, and that is, of course, the election called for the 12th of the 12th. So we're going to look at what that might mean, what we know, what we don't know, as the parties gear up to put their manifestos out. So, first off, I thought we'd start with some of the things that we do know, some of the known knowns for the general election, which is, by most measures, agreed to be one of the most difficult to call, probably in human history.
So, yes, this is my 4th general election as HSJ editor, first one being in 2005. When the election was called, a newsletter came out from one of the papers in which there was a piece one of the correspondents had written 12 ways in which the general election is difficult to call. I think they could have quite easily, had they had enough time, said 112 ways in which the general election is difficult to call. I mean, the various outcomes and the implications of those various outcomes are bewildering in their nature. But there are some things that we can be sort of confident about, relatively confident about, regardless of the election result. One is that the NHS is going to get more money. There is the traditional arms race in promises for NHS funding. I think, though it could well have changed by the time I say this, the Tories are currently just out ahead, but no doubt Labour will be looking to claim that their spending will be higher. The actual figures don't really matter. There's plenty of research to show that electorates can't tell much difference between billions and millions, let alone the number of billions or the number of millions. But there is more money coming, and the arms race will mean that increase in money will get greater. Still probably not going to be enough. Both parties, both Labour and Conservatives, will promise to fund the NHS properly. Of course, then you have a debate about what the word properly means.
Because for a bit of context, like the coalition years and the 4 years subsequent to that, kind of the economists that have looked at that have been fairly clear that it was less than, I mean, these weren't cuts in NHS budget at any point, but it was less than the service would have needed to cope with the increases in demand, which are typically about 4%.
Indeed, and of course it was less given the fact that there were enormous cuts elsewhere in other public services, which produced greater demand onto the NHS. And there are various other factors, like the fact that we began to get a whole set of blockbuster drugs, which we hadn't had for most of the noughties, that put cost pressures into the NHS. It was the first thing that Simon Stevens mentioned to me when he came back as NHS chief executive, was that this cost pressure from new medical technologies was going to be a big issue for the NHS in the years to come, and so it proved. So if money, more money but not enough money, is one of the certainties, I think the other certainty another certainty is that the internal market is over. The purchase of provider split experiment created almost exactly 30 years ago. Working for Patients white paper came out in 1989, creating the internal market and establishing the purchase provider split. It isn't quite dead yet, but it is almost dead. The Conservatives have set their face against it. It will surprise no one to know that a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour Party are against it. And there is nobody in the NHS who holds a torch for it. So I think we can confidently say it is on its way out. This way in which the NHS has been organised for 30 years, this era is coming to an end. Precisely what will replace it, we don't know. And I look forward to the editorials I write in 3 years' time, where we talk about all the things that we miss from the purchaser-provider split. But I think if we have a Labour government, it will go quicker than if we have a Conservative government, but going it is. The third thing that we know, regardless of the election result, is that demand growth is going to continue to outstrip the physical and staffing capacity of the service for some years now. Regardless of how much money gets poured in, recruiting, training staff, and building buildings and to a lesser extent buying kit is going to take a while. Austerity arrived relatively late in the NHS. It had had so much money during the noughties that it had a lot of fat to live off, and it did get a very small real terms increase. So it arrived relatively late in the NHS. I'd say probably around 2014-15, but it's equally going to stick around in the NHS for longer than for the next 2 or 3 years at least, despite increased funding.
And that's going to be most particularly in staffing, isn't it, where there's obviously a big lag in the bringing through and training of staff. I mean, we've seen that with some of the warnings some of the Royal Colleges have put out about, specifically on radiology, which is a big commitment for the long-term plan, is to move into more early diagnostics. But the however much you pump into new scanners, there's still not enough radiologists to man them by some way.
Yes, I mean there's a real catch-22 situation here in which you need the equipment, both buildings and kit, CT scanners, etc., to, for example, deal with the bottleneck in cancer diagnostics that you have at the moment. But equally, you need the staff to operate them. I think it's slightly different. With kit, it's about a procurement process. That can be sped up, but we've got plenty of examples of how sped up procurement processes could go wrong. With buildings, they just take a while to build. You can use temporary accommodation and things like that, but they just take a while. And when I mean take a while, I'm not so much talking about putting one brick on top of the other. The construction industry can move astonishingly quickly now when it wants to. It's the business cases getting signed off by the Treasury. Matt Hancock has promised a much more streamlined process, but I'll believe it when I see it. With staffing, it's slightly different, I think, actually, because there is a long-term solution, a medium to long-term solution, which is about training and improving retention, and that is pretty much in train now. We'll see, and there have been some success. Nursing, there's been some success with nurses on retention. But if you want to do something very quickly, then the only thing you can really do is bring staff in from overseas. And I won't insult the intelligence of our podcast listeners to suggest that as a new government declaring that you're bringing over thousands of foreign doctors and nurses might not resonate with the messages that you had been putting out during the election campaign.
Yeah, in fact, we saw a story this week about a Lincolnshire trust where 50% of their BME staff had said they'd encountered racial abuse from patients. So it's a quite a live issue for those staff. And the general election, of course, they don't often happen in late December. Well, mid-December. Kind of, is there any particular implications you think for that timing?
Well, we've seen already some commentary about what winter pressures will have, the NHS's winter pressures will have on their general election campaign. James is our expert on this, of course. So I'd just say two things. One is, which will both be obvious to our podcast listeners. One is the NHS's winter. Usually, what is described as the NHS winter usually doesn't start until the first week in January, and typically runs throughout January to the middle of February. The second thing to say is, though, however, for the last couple of years, and certainly the last year, winter has never ended. We are going to get a lot of focus on struggling A&Es over the next 5 weeks. But quite honestly, they won't be struggling any more than they were struggling in August. You can look at places like Nottingham and Leicester and others, and to see that that performance, the performance in some of the East Midlands trusts, is the kind of performance you would expect in the worst possible winters. I think it won't be that the NHS performance will suddenly get much worse in the next 6 weeks, and therefore that will be a big issue. It's just attention will be being drawn to those trusts which have been struggling now month in, month out for over a year.
Yeah, I'd certainly echo all of that. Certainly in terms of the last summer quarter against the 4-hour target, that was the worst on record. So performance over the summer has effectively been running at winter level system-wide as well. Statistically, the worst months over winter have generally been in February and March. In February 2019, the 4-hour target hit a new low, only to go lower again in March. So it doesn't even necessarily end in February. You've still got to get through March, and April was pretty tricky as well. The winter before that was the Beast of the East winter, a lot of flu around. Simon Stevens described February 2018 as the most pressured month the NHS had ever had. So the government will be hoping that winter doesn't kick in early, but certainly it's going to be record-breakingly bad. It's just a case of at what point that cranks up. But as Alastair rightly pointed out, it's not necessarily that performance is going to be any better or worse than it has been over the last 12 months. It's more that there'll be a focus on it. And something that's happened over the last couple of winters is that Brexit has distracted the media from the woes of the NHS. And despite missing target after target after target, the NHS to some extent has not had the scrutiny from the media that it might expect for such performance. And Matt Hancock last winter to some extent got quite an easy ride, really. I don't think that's going to be the case this winter. Whether it will impact on the election is going to be more about perception rather than reality. But yeah, we don't really expect
where politicians decide to look for bad news stories about the NHS, they will find plenty of them. There is plenty of ammunition for the for opposition parties to use against the government on the NHS. Missed targets on elective A&E, cancer, etc. And I suspect that there will be a lot of focus on individual organisations who are particularly struggling, and it may be interesting to see whether 2 or 3 of them become sort of the bellwethers for the NHS as a whole, and therefore I think it is particularly interesting those trusts in the East Midlands, which are real sort of swing vote areas. They could be, their performance could be quite significant in deciding the fate of various individual constituency elections.
Yeah, last winter we saw some trusts go sub 50% on their Type 1 A&E performance. Now, as Alastair says, if that happens in certain areas where votes are very tight, that could certainly be significant. So yeah.
I think there's also a curveball that maybe the NHS hasn't thought about enough, but there's been reports that the flu vaccine for children and the flu vaccine for under 65s is having quite a lot of national shortages, especially in the children area. So it might well be that we don't even need a bad flu season, just access issues to find that those problems are really ramping up within emergency departments.
And, that is a very good point. If flu hit early, and particularly if it hit at a time where a large number of children were vaccinated. My son was vaccinated yesterday, which I was very, very relieved about when he came back with his little certificate. But if flu hit early and a number of children, were badly ill, or heaven forbid, even died of flu, that is the kind of thing which it is incredibly difficult for a government to defend, and so in terms of a winter pressure, a real winter pressure, then yes, indeed, that might be something that could have a very significant impact.
There's quite a lot of unknowns, obviously, in the campaign, and how that how the NHS affects that. The things we've covered are kind of things that you could predict. Like Alastair says, you could find problems in performance if we're having to look too hard. Kind of the elective waiting list has about 4.4 million people on it, which is about 1 million people more than it did 3 years ago. One of whom, Dominic Cummings, apparently is expecting his operation soon. It says in the papers. But but there's a bunch of things we don't know. A lot of questions we don't yet have kind of proper answers on.
So, yeah, I mean, this will be a general election campaign filled with speculation. 98.9% of it will prove to be wrong. But there are some things that some important things that we might get some clues on over the next 5 or 6 weeks. We'll find out whether people are really serious about social care. Various promises have been made. Labour proposing free domiciliary care, but which would clearly be a very significant reform, and something the NHS would very much welcome. But in terms of long-term funding for social care, to put it on some kind of sustainable footing, most of the people who've looked at this suggest that it would require people to pay more of their own money in some kind of way. And, well, it doesn't seem to be that after the 2010 election with Andy Burnham's death tax, or the 2017 election with Theresa May's dementia tax, which Jeremy Hunt was given the job of going out and selling on the manifesto launch day, I remember. Some of the podcast listeners may be readers of our Bedpan political interview series. Time after time, I've interviewed politicians who have said that we're now, of both parties, that we're now going nowhere near that kind of reform, because it is absolutely political kryptonite to do so, which is, of course, very worrying.
But Alastair, while it also might be political kryptonite to not come up with or not publishing policies that may require people to pay in more, if you talk to local government association, social care is obviously in a crisis. But what that means is that people who would have got help, say 10 years ago, are not getting that help now. And there will be people who, going into the election, will be wondering why their parents are being left to cope alone without any access to domiciliary care to help them wash and eat and dress. So it could play badly on one side, with people wanting their parents to have more help, but then equally with no one offering a solution. So it could become quite a tense issue.
I personally, I would love social care rather than the NHS. If we had to be an issue that was at the forefront of this political campaign, a general election debate. If we had a debate just during general election about the difficult choices that we had to make about ensuring we had a sustainable care system, to use the broadest possible definition, that would be much, much better than the kind of knockabout We Love the NHS campaign that it appears we are likely to have, but I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah, and of course the social care thing plays into one of the other big themes of the last couple of years, in that the social care workforce is something that was explicitly singled out in the Yellowhammer documents.
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of Brexit, throughout the various planning phases, the major concerns for the NHS has been around continuity of supply of medicines. Actually, they've made quite a lot of progress since the March exit date and now the October exit date. But the social care workforce really is something that NHS leaders are still very concerned about. There's concerns that workers will, from the EU, will go home over Christmas and then not come back again. There's concerns that they will take jobs in seasonal work, such as packing in for delivery companies, and again, maybe not come back. So in terms overall with Brexit at the moment, what has happened has effectively the October 31st no deal cliff edge has been pushed back to January 31st. So despite the government overall saying that it is standing down Operation Yellowhammer, which is its sort of broad package of contingency planning for a no deal Brexit, stuff like sort of how they would deal with civil unrest, motorway disruptions, all that kind of planning. That's been stood down, but the NHS has quite sensibly said, look, there's only 50 odd working days to go between now and the 31st of January, when there could technically be another no deal. So we're going to keep our preparations on course. There's a couple of things that have been paused around sort of data collections, these so-called Brexit sit reps, which just involve keeping tabs on stock levels. It's quite a forensic exercise of medicines and other supplies across the NHS. That's been put on pause till January. But the message from Keith Willett, NHS England's Brexit chief overall, is continue to prepare for a no deal.
I think if you look at election outcomes as well, no one quite knows. A lot of people who were entrenched in their Tory and Labour voting, they're talking much more about people potentially switching and what issues will make them do that. I think if you look at the medicine preparation around no deal, a lot of people with long-term health conditions feel very let down by the current government's push that they're going to leave the EU by whatever means. If you look at the National Audit Office, I think they said 9% of medicines hadn't been stockpiled. For people who rely on those, that seems a massive... it seems like people are really kind of challenging people's lives and the way they live on for a political means. And you could well see those people becoming one vote and one issue voters.
You could equally saying that those people would say, well, let's get Brexit done so that we can control immigration, and therefore we don't have people demanding the medicine that I want to take. So I think that's the trouble with Brexit. It becomes a binary issue which you can paint in either direction. Let's face it, I think we'd all like to think this would be an election that was decided on careful thought by the people who live in swing constituencies, but it would be, and that may happen. Let's hope so. But it's emotion that seems to be driving much of the campaign. If the first few days are anything to go by, maybe it'll improve.
But probably whatever happens, unless we get some very, very, very strange sort of coalition, is that there will be some kind of either Labour or Conservative-led government. And there'll be, and it is a live question for our listeners, like what kind of NHS bill we might see as a result.
Since the 2012 Act, everyone around this table and other HSJ colleagues have heard senior NHS leaders and politicians say to them, both public and privately, is the one thing we're not doing is any NHS legislation. No top-down reform from us. That is another form of political kryptonite. I think enough time has passed and the need has grown great enough, and there are various political imperatives behind it to be reasonably sure that we will get another chunky piece of NHS legislation, hurrah, in the next few years, and whether it's Labour or Tory, precisely what will be in that kind of legislation, we shall find out. I think we've got a reasonable view of what this current Conservative government might do. But as is being made today, the point has been made today with the resignation, standing down people like Amber Rudd and Nicky Morgan, etc., and the departure of people like Philip Hammond, etc., from the... This is going to be a very different Conservative Party post the election, as it's going to be quite a different Labour Party post the election. And therefore, precisely the nature of those reforms are one of those other things that's quite difficult to determine. One of the questions that's being asked about Boris Johnson is, is he the one nation, liberal Conservative, which he has been up to this date, or is he cutting his cloth because he's going to be leading a party which will be more to the right? And of course, with the Labour Party, there are some astonishingly radical ideas floating around within the Labour movement. Many of those have been resisted so far by those politicians, the Blairites, as their opponents in the party would call them. But many of those Blairites will be going. Either they lose their seats, or that they will be replaced by more Corbyn-friendly alternatives. And then who knows what kind of reforms we will get. But we may get some more clues on that in the next few weeks. It is really quite significant what the nature of those reforms, because the nature of the reforms that the parties might introduce, because the NHS is set on a reform trajectory at the moment, albeit one without any kind of statutory underpinning, but the creation of STPs and ICSs. How great a divergence are we going to get from that, if at all, in the general election, after the general election, will be something that we may get some kind of sense on over the next 6 weeks or so.
I mean, there's already signs of some congruence on things like the independence of FTs. So the people who are sort of in charge of Labour at the moment are people who would have voted against the creation of FTs in the first place, while at the same time Matt Hancock's been talking about wanting to take greater control over key FT freedoms like control of a capital budget. So
it's like it'll be like the 21st century never happened. I mean, literally taking the NHS back to a way of running that looks like the way it was run in the year 2000 is, I think arguably the way that that we're going, but then maybe back even further. But who knows? Labour have talked about significantly increasing the influence of local government, and of course, which has been the longest running debate in the NHS, when they decided against the Morrison model, against giving the NHS to local government. I don't think anybody's proposing that, but who knows?
Well, on that note of understandable uncertainty, I'm going to say thank you all for listening to the HSJ Health Check Podcast. We're here again next week. We publish on Friday. You can download it from HSJ's website or wherever else you get your podcasts from. If there's anything you want us to discuss or tackle, then please get in touch. I'll be hosting next week. My email is ben.clover@wilmingtonhealthcare.com. Please spread the word. We'll see you next week. Thanks, my colleagues, for joining us. And thank you, listener, for joining us.
Thanks.